Namaste and welcome everyone. I hope you've had a good week. Hope you are well and plenty happy. The episode 4, the fourth story in this collection of short stories in the book Thanks for the Yellow Roses, is the one that's labeled No More Inaugurals for Me. May sound like a strange title, but you'll catch on as I go through it. Here it goes. I want to tell you a few stories about my mom and dad. They didn't actually die. They just traded in their earthly asbestos suits for the sets of angel wings. In any event, both my dad and mom have passed into the new realm, flew the coop, returned to their full-time spirit being ship, whatever terminology makes you aware of your immortality, instead of believing in the fictitious mortality concept that has been foisted upon us. To the mortal way of thinking, there is birth and death. But in reality, in spiritual life, life is simply and beautifully and faithfully goes on and on and on in various forms. I have come to believe that stories are one of the main reasons we come to this planet, for us to actually become the stories that will inform and inspire others to become what we all really are, lovers of the first order. Our stories can inspire and inform. It's our stories, pardon me, ooh, that's a deep one. Our stories can inspire and inform. It's our stories that embolden, that ennoble, that dignify one another. Our stories are what transforms fear into love as the only reality that is. It's what gives life its purpose. We all have purpose, and I don't mean purpose in the sense of different strokes for different folks. I mean we all have just one purpose, one and the same for each of us, only we get to demonstrate it differently among us, using our innate gifts each in our own way. This is where my stories about Mom and Dad began to take focus. Dad was a painter, primarily a house painter, but also a painter of buildings, bridges, and the like. In the latter years of his life, he passed away at 78 while still working full-time. He mostly painted houses. He lovingly turned them into homes. I have always admiringly referred to him as the Leonardo da Vinci of house painting, because he was an artist first and foremost above all. The houses he painted were rendered with the utmost care and attention. Indeed, they became, actually, pieces of art. But this is not where his artistry stopped, not by a long shot. He painted his life with his stories, his funny sayings, his insistence on asking every housewife who kept an eye on him while he painted if they had something to drink. Inevitably, they would bring him a glass of water. And just as inevitably, he would say in a laughing voice, "What? No orange juice, no pineapple juice, no cranberry juice? Ah, this country no good, Chicago all right." And now just try to continue a conversation with that as an opener. Of course, it was just a statement of his humor, and it never seemed to matter if anyone else laughed or not. It was good enough for him that he just enjoyed doing it. From time to time, Dad was also a restaurant owner, and he loved to tell stories. As a Greek immigrant, his naturalized citizen's semi-thick Greek accent made his stories even more interesting, to me at least. Some of my friends used to smile at Dad's accent. I just thought it was normal for him and enjoyed how he said things in ways we sure wouldn't, like saying sheep for ship and mischievous for mischievous. The long and short of it is that he brought life into the ways he communicated with people. He uplifted them with his compassion, emboldened them with his integrity, enlivened them with his sense of humor, lit them up with his extraordinary respect for human dignity. He didn't talk about these things. He lived them. That's the real point of it all. The point of life, that is. That was his purpose, to live as a living being he was, true to himself, with his delightful, loving personality showing through, no matter what it was he was doing. His story and thus his purpose was simply being the lover he was. Our purpose is exactly that. No more, no less. I recall a bit of the story Dad told me one afternoon about in our hometown of Silver Creek, New York, population 3,200, counting everything that moved, including leaves on trees. Actually, it was more like a moral lesson. I was about 10 years old, I think, maybe 12, but no older. I liked helping my dad in the small restaurant he ran at the time. His partner, Dan, had died from cancer, and Dad had to run it by himself, with Mom, partly my sister Virginia, and me helping as we could. Actually, Virginia seemed more interested in boys by then, so I don't recall her being around that much, but I could be mistaken. And our brother Bill was much too young to help. Dad worked very long hours, and it nearly burned him out and did him in. As a matter of fact, good old Dr. Barisi once said to him, "Harry, you better stop smoking and drinking so much coffee, or you'll be dead a lot sooner than you think." That was one admonition from someone he respected, was all Dad needed. Immediately he sold the restaurant and went back to painting for a living. Anyhow, late one muggy afternoon in mid-July, it began to sprinkle, just as the shade began to cool the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. I was sitting on one of the dozen or so stools at the lunch counter, and Dad was sitting right behind me. Nothing much was going on. It was too late for the lunch crowd and too early for the dinner group. Dad and I had made sure that everything was ready for the dinner hour. All the dishes from the lunch had been washed and put away. The salt and pepper shakers and sugar bowls had been restocked. The mustard and ketchup bottles refilled. Floors swept, bathroom cleaned, food stock returned to full status, and empty napkin containers restored. We were ready no matter who or what would show its face. At this point, we were simply sitting there, catching our breath. Seemingly out of nowhere, two figures appeared just outside the large, expansive window that separated the cooking grill from the sidewalk passersby. One, a black man called Ernie, was dressed in overalls and a long-sleeved shirt, a railroad engineer's hat adorning his head. The other man, a Caucasian named Chicago, the only name I ever heard him called, wore a short-sleeved shirt, jeans, and woolen pancake hat. Both of them were obviously tipsy, which was their custom, it seemed. They pressed their faces against the window pane, first one, then the other, and then did their own version of a dance. Ernie always followed Chicago's lead. Chicago leaned into the window and then, twisting sideways, twirled his hat to the side, saying, "Hi, fellas," to us, and then broke away in a stunted pirouette. Ernie followed suit, with nary a variation in his step, then swayed up the street in tandem with Chicago. His dad said, "You see, son, good and bad fall on all alike. No more, no less, just that." His profundity hung there in the air, huge as a bright harvest moon, just long enough for it to sink into this young man's head. The full understanding moved from my head to my heart as Dad got up, shaking his head compassionately, and we went back to work. When I was even younger, before Dad returned to restaurant work to help his partner, he was painting at the Bethlehem Steel Factory in Lackawanna, a steel city of roughly 53,000 people, just south of Buffalo, New York. If either my sister or I got into trouble or messed with my mother, she generally wouldn't handle the situation herself. She'd save the punishment for Dad to dole out. Well, he didn't like this at all, and while I never heard him talk to her about it, he finally took care of it in his own way. One day I had apparently did something untoward, and my mom had sent me to my room with the admonition, "You wait till your father gets home. Are you ever going to get it?" I had learned by then that this didn't always mean like how it sounded. I had figured out that sometimes this was meant just to scare my sister or me. My brother Bill was still too young to be concerned about such matters. On the other hand, every now and then her words became truth, but I was beginning to discern that Dad didn't like being used as the one to punish. I think in this case that giving us a spanking really did hurt him more than it did us. Well, maybe. Or perhaps this is just an adult thinking that now, not a less than 10-year-old then. On this one particular day, Dad came home from work and Mom launched into an overly dramatic description of what this devil's act I had allegedly committed was, and Dad took me down to the basement to distribute the appropriate punishment. When we got down there, he whispered, "When I slapped the side of my leg, You just pretend to cry. No more explanation than that. I was startled, so he slapped his thigh, and I pretended to cry. Two amateur actors, for better or worse. My sister affirms that Dad did the same with her, too. In retrospect, I think sooner or later Mom caught on, but she never said anything to any of us about it. All I know for sure is that both the threats and the spankings ceased soon after. I guess that's all it took to change my ways and Mom's. On another occasion, when I was about 16, I was working side by side with Dad, painting houses in the summer to earn money for college. One evening after work and an early dinner, a couple of friends and I went to Dunkirk, a blue-collar town about 10 miles away. Our purpose was to go to this one bar where they had a dance band playing every weekend and to see if we could pick up some girls. Lee and I were too young to drink. Plus, I was a dedicated athlete and didn't want to drink. But Bob was 18, and he and Lee decided they wanted to have a gin and tonic. I let myself be talked into risking having one, unfortunately, and so Bob ordered a round for all of us. While occasionally sipping the drink, I started feeling a little dizzy and excused myself to go to the men's room. I figured that if I stalled for time, maybe this would wear off, or we decided to leave before I had to finish the drink. When I returned, there was a fresh drink in front of all of us. I didn't order this, I chimed. Oh, come on, Jimmy boy, this won't hurt you any, Bob chided. Back then, I suppose I didn't want any confrontation, or at the very least, I didn't want my friends to think I was some kind of a wuss, so I let it go. Big mistake. Again, I sipped faithfully to their purpose. I kept wondering when we were going to try to pick up some of the chicks, that's what we called them back then, but we never quite got to it. Sometime later, I went, or should I say, staggered into the bathroom again, this time swearing to myself that I wasn't going to finish this drink. I was beginning to feel sick to my stomach. You guessed it. Another fresh drink was waiting for us when I returned. Very long story made short. Several drinks later, none ever fully consumed, but collectively amounting to 2 full drinks, I would guess, far more than enough for someone who didn't drink. I declared the evening over for me. I was really getting sick, and the place started to spin around me. Lee and Bob nearly had to carry me out to the car. On the way home, I got more and more dizzy, and my stomach was becoming more and more queasy. At one point, I lurched toward the front seat and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Stop, I'm going to throw up." Bob pulled over with the nick of time. How, I'll never know, but by the time Bob stopped, I had rolled down the window, and as the car came to a screeching halt, I vomited all down the outside of the car. On some level, I'm sure, that was the least I could do to get even with them. When they got me home, I had to pee real bad, so I did, right on my front lawn. I think I remember at least gagging some more, maybe even spilling my guts. It's all still such a blur in my memory. I staggered into the house, horrified to see Dad watching the late news on television. I simply waved as I passed him on the way upstairs. He said only, "Good night, Jim." When I got upstairs and looked into the bathroom mirror, I saw an unholy mess. My shirt was spattered with vomit and hanging half out of my pants. My fly was open and part of my shirt tail hung out like a limp penis, and my face was as pale as a painted ghost on Halloween night. A fear filled me. Oh my God, Dad's going to kill me in the morning, came crashing through in my wildest imagination as I staggered feebly to bed and spun myself into an ugly stupor. The next thing I remembered was Dad calling me up to get up for work. I had no earthly idea how I would climb a ladder, let alone sling a 6-inch brush all day long. But I decided I'd be better off taking my punishment like a man rather than feigning illness and paying for it later. Well, we went to work, and neither of us said much of anything for a while. We prepared the paint, set up our ladders, and up the ladders to paint we went. To this day, I have no idea how I got even one step off the ground. Befitting our regiment, at about 10 o'clock, we broke for something to drink. Dad usually carried coffee in his thermos, and I'd have water. When I finally managed to navigate my way down the ladder without falling off, I just sat there like a bump on a log. Dad handed me a glass of juice he had managed to obtain from the grips of the lady of the house. After I had weakly taken a sip or two, Dad interrupted my safe space saying, "Feeling any better?" Not another word. Not a scolding. Not a moral lesson. No chastisement. Nothing. Just, "Feeling any better?" I got the point real well. It's no wonder I say to this day that my dad was the best man I ever met. A wonderful teacher, to be sure. Incidentally, I found out later that week from my so-called friends that while I was in the restroom, that first time they had arranged with the waitress for me to continue getting gin and tonics while their glasses were refilled with just some water and lime. I never really did get even with them for this, nor have I had a glass of gin and tonic since. Just two other quick stories about Dad and me. He never pried, never asked personal questions, except twice in my entire time with him. The first time was after I had received my doctorate. It was an associate vice president at Buffalo State College. One day when I was visiting Dad in Silver Creek, he asked me after dinner one evening, "Jim, do you mind if I ask how much money you make now that you've got your doctor's degree?" "Not at all, Dad. I make $22,800. "What?" he replied in astonishment. "That's all you make?" "Yes, but I really enjoy what I do. After all, you're the one who taught me how to enjoy everything I do." After what seemed like an interminable pause, Dad followed with his note. "Do you remember Bob Evans?" "Sure I do. Why do you ask?" was my rejoinder. "Well," Dad continued in all seriousness, "I just finished painting his place. He's an orthodontist, you know, and he wasn't anywhere near the top of the class like you were. He drives a Mercedes and owns his office building and a lovely home on the lake, and he flies his own airplane. If you'll go back to school and be a dentist, I'll work extra to pay for your schooling. You can't make only $20-something thousand a year after going to college this long." This from a man who never, to my knowledge, made even that much in a year. Never in all his working life. The only other time he asked me a personal question was years later, the day after a celebration dinner when I was inaugurated as the president of Potsdam College in northern New York. I could not have been happier, not because I had finally made it as president, but because both my mom and dad were alive to witness how what they had done in raising me had contributed so richly to reaching the pinnacle in my chosen profession. On that early spring morning, with frost still melting off the silvered grass and rooftops nearby, we were leisurely sharing a delectable brunch being served in our family room that overlooked the Raquette River as it divided the town into its two different halves. During a lull in conversation, Dad got up to refill his coffee cup, and I joined him in the kitchen. As he poured the cream into his cup, "Always the cream first, before the coffee," he'd say. "Mind if I ask you a personal question?" The suddenness struck me like a bump in the night. "Not at all, Dad. What's up?" "Well, your mother and I were talking last night, and we wondered, does this job require you to drink?" "Require me to drink?" "No. Why?" "Because after seeing all of the guests at the party drank yesterday, your mother and I grew afraid that you might become an alcoholic." I was stunned by his question, yet moved to glistening eyes by his compassion and sincerity of interest in this matter. "No, Dad, I'm not required to drink. As a matter of fact, I rarely drink at all. And when I do, it's only very little there, because I don't want to put myself in the position of not being in full control of what I'm saying or doing." "Whew, that's good," was his relieved response. "Your mom will be glad to hear that, and so am I." I never heard another word about drinking from him. Mom, she was a little different from Dad. He was gregarious, she was shy and withdrawn. Dad was non-intrusive. Mom was nosy, pure and simple. She had to know everything that was going on and why, or why not. While it was not the style back then for parents to tell you they loved you out loud, I never doubted that either of my parents loved me. Only with Dad you could feel that his love pouring from him full force. He was love himself. Mom, she was more reserved, and you knew her love more by how much she did for you rather than from any deep connection or emotional outflow. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until much later in life, when I was in my 30s, I remember, that I regularly began telling my folks that I loved them and gave them a big hug when we parted. That seemed to release them to regularly respond in a similar fashion. The exchange wasn't really necessary because I already knew the truth about them loving me. But it was nice to have that love affirmed this way nonetheless, and I think it was for them too. When anyone came into Mom's home, they could quickly discern a few things. The wonderful penetrating smell of home-baked desserts like a luscious German chocolate cake, or the best chocolate chip cookies in the universe, or the most extraordinary French lemon or butterscotch pie you would ever put in your mouth. Flowers and plants caressed you wherever you went. The fireplace in the new home was never used, and you could eat off their floors, and the inside and outside of the house took turns being painted on alternative years, just like Virginia, Bill, and I took turns taking a bath in the one family bathroom, and always a bath, never a shower. That way there were no tiled walls to clean up afterwards. And Mom had the most magnificent yard in town. The lawn looked like an infield in Yankee Stadium, closely mowed in crosshatch pattern, free from debris, so the eyes and soul could reach directly beyond to the flower gardens without interruption. The house was surrounded by textures and colors of an intuitively perfect setting. It was fronted by deep green shrubs that were surrounded by a lush sculpture of shady pachysandra, interrupted now and then with brilliant red geraniums or a patch of multicolored portulaca in the sunny areas. The side garden, which stretched from the front sidewalk all the way behind the house to the garage, was filled with scores of roses of every size, shape, and description. The back garden, which flooded back to the fence protecting against the wall over a steep precipice, was likewise candy for the large size. In summertime, people from all over town would come for a walk past the house, hoping either Mom or Dad would invite them for a closer look, actually to feast on an aesthetic buffet. Although either Dad or I mowed the lawn and swept and hosed the driveway, it was for Mom who always tended the garden. That, like the inside of the house, was her domain, and there was no doubt about it. Just try walking through the door without first taking off your shoes, and you'd sure find that out. I have to say it was good to learn about cleanliness and order, even if sometimes it felt like just too much. But these ingredients, just like when Mom taught me how to wash and iron and cook, has served me well throughout life, and I am ever grateful. Yep, she sure was a keeper. On another level, I always felt Mom held me back some. It was my thing to deal with, obviously. Didn't mean she really did that. I could never put my finger on it, but it felt that way nevertheless. While both Mom and Dad supported and encouraged me in what I did, I never felt disappointment from Dad like I did Mom when I didn't actually achieve what was exactly desired or expected. Now that attitude, much like our own inner critic, can be marvelous when it helps us discern the need to improve and shows us how to do it correctly. But when it even only occasionally beats you down with unreasonable expectations, it can render the soul black and blue. I love her all the same. Not long ago, some latent form of resentment about Mom's use of criticism or shame came up in my face. I don't know why, but it did. I was photographing rural poverty, meandering to and fro across the back roads of Arkansas. It was a scorcher of a summer. You could see water mirages far ahead on the roads everywhere I went, and even the mosquitoes seemed to have found the air too humid and thick in which to fly. They seemed to be doing a slow backstroke through the water-laden air, adorning hip waders. Whatever it was that triggered this emotional upsurge, I'll probably never know. But I wanted to get angrier and angrier at Mom. I couldn't seem to stop the downward spiral of emotional venom towards her. I knew I didn't normally feel this way about her, and that I loved her deeply, yet somehow I just couldn't seem to break the tide. All at once I heard this inner voice say, "Ask for help." I thought for a moment about that and dismissed it out of hand, thinking, ask who for what? Another moment passed and the same voice repeated, ask for help. I got it this time. I had learned to listen to my intuition and to be obedient to its voice. No matter how unusual the message might have seemed, but had been stirred off course momentarily by my feelings of anger and resentment, obviously I had something stuck. In the next breath, I sought inwardly, I need some help here. I need just one simple reminder of why I love Mom so much. I want to get rid of this damn anger. Not a half minute later, I came around a bend in this dusty country road and found myself full flush with bed after bed after bed of bright flowers, chrysanthemums of all colors, bright orange marigolds, brilliant purple and pink cosmos, you name it. I thought for a moment that I had died and gone to flower heaven. Their perfectly composed hues and tones brought tears to my eyes and took my breath away, sort of like seeing one of my newborn children for the first time, or the feeling I got inside the first time I thought I had fallen in love. And this resonated with the authenticity of my love for my real first love on this planet, Mom. The gratitude I felt was indescribable. The gratitude for what she taught me about the beauty of flowers and colors and textures, all of which were but life's manifestations of the beauty she was. And suddenly, from the same sacred place from which those gilded words had guided me past just moments ago, the gratitude for life itself filled me to the brim. I mentioned to you that Mom was shy. She was so shy that her brothers used to tease her about without let up. Or maybe it was the other way around, but I don't remember it that way. I remember so many times when Uncle Bill, Uncle Eddie, or Uncle Stanley, Mom was one of 6 in a first-generation Polish family, one or the other, or in rapid serial fashion, would tease her about the ants in her banana bread or the bunny droppings in her Toll House cookies. Then they started in with Polish jokes. Mom didn't take to them too kindly. As a matter of fact, she found them downright rude and didn't buy into the argument her brothers made that it was okay for a Polak to tell Polish jokes on themselves. It wasn't until her later years that she began to see the cause with different eyes, so to speak. Apparently, my sister Virginia had taken it upon herself to reframe the issue somehow. It doesn't really matter how it happened, only that it did. I'll never forget the first time Mom told me a Polish joke. I was so astonished I didn't laugh. I think her feelings were hurt. After I recovered, we told a few to each other, and all was well again. Mom had taken on a sense of humor of her own and perhaps became a little less prideful in the process. One thing I'll tell you, it warmed my heart to see her laugh, and it was even more delightful to see that slightly mischievous look in her eye as she got ready to tell yet another. To me, Mom and Dad seemed inseparable. When they finally got to build their own house, the last one they owned, they had a minister build it. I was married and living elsewhere at the time, and from time to time I'd visit, both to be in their company, but also to see how the house was coming along. The minister had only one eye, and he was one of the best carpenters I have ever met. A true artist. He custom-made every cupboard and fashioned every nook and cranny in that house. Every brick was placed just right. All square angles were perfect. Each fireplace stone was set as it should be. Each night at work's end, and it really was nightfall, not 5 o'clock in the afternoon, for Mr. Munson worked long days. He'd go to Mom and Dad's rental place up the street before he left and read the Bible with them. Such reverence became a habit, and more frequent were the times thereafter where I'd find them putting the day to bed in the Word. Also, Mother never learned to drive, so everywhere she went, she either had to walk or she'd wait until Dad came home from work and they'd go grocery shopping or play bingo or having dinner out. Oh my, did Mom ever like to play bingo, and she often won. Probably not as often as she said she did, but I've been with her when she did win several times at one sitting. In hindsight, this dependency she had on Dad to drive her everywhere could have easily been a codependency, but Dad never seemed to mind it at all. He seemed to cherish it, and her above all. Perhaps instead of a codependency, it was simply being in love and loving whatever you do with the one you love. They both taught that very well. Earlier I referred to my inauguration. You remember, it was when Dad had asked me a personal question about drinking. Well, 2 months to the day after that, Dad died. I rather put it that he'd moved on to teach spiritual storytelling to the angels. He went as he wanted, though. He once told Virginia 3 things he wanted about his death. The first was that he would die working. The second was that he wanted a closed casket. The third was that he wanted the Masons to be present at his wake. Dad fell off a ladder, still painting, at 87 years old, mind you, and he died almost instantly of a fractured skull. Because of the fracture, there was immense swelling, so his body was not shown. Despite early protestations by the local priest to the contrary, we finally got clearance for his Mason friends to have a separate ceremony for Dad. And the last time anyone saw him alive, he was standing at the foot of his ladder telling stories and laughing with some passers-by. There are no words to convey the depth of what I then called my loss. Since then, I have counted the blessings the extraordinary man brought with his life over and over again. They matched and even exceeded the gratitude I felt for my life, for his giftedness to me. I hope I picked up even a few of his wonderful ways. About 4 years later, I was inaugurated as a chancellor at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. My sister and Mom were dumbfounded by my move from upstate New York to the South. I don't think it mattered much to my brother one bit, except for missing one another. I seem to recall both Mom and Virginia envisioning Arkansas as a hillbilly state filled with barefoot, corncob pipe smokers. I had wanted Mom to consider moving to Arkansas to live, but she was still attracted to the house that she and Dad had made home. Plus, she wasn't all sure of what she'd find in this rural southern state. Both she and Virginia attended the inauguration and related festivities and found their preconceptions to be hardly erroneous. Hugely erroneous. For me, the most profound highlight of that occasion, actually, I can honestly say my entire home time in Arkansas, over a decade and all, was a seemingly innocent happening. Bill Clinton, then governor, was the featured luncheon speaker following the installation event. As usual, he was witty, brilliant, entertaining, captivating, and sweeping in his knowledge of the university and how it was contributing to the general welfare of his state. After lunch, as was his usual procedure, his secret policeman came up behind Governor Clinton and simply touched him lightly on the shoulder to let him know it was time to move on. Bill turned to me and said, "Jim, is there anything else I can do to make this event even more special for you?" Can you imagine? After thanking him profusely for what he already had done, I had the temerity to say, there is one very brief thing that would put the finishing touches on it all. Could you take just a minute to say a word or two to my mother and my mother-in-law? They're right over there at that table. Of course I will, he responded with his usual social generosity, and off he went. After taking not a minute, but a full 10 minutes with each of them, he gracefully departed with my unending gratitude in tow. As I looked over at the Mom and my mother-in-law, their faces were beaming from ear to ear. I can't imagine what he must have said to them. Little did I know at the time how even more grateful I would become to Governor Clinton for that one kind gesture. Several days later, I called Mom to see how her return trip went and how she was doing generally. She seemed to still be grieving and missing Dad a lot. I was coming to understand what it meant to have our heart broken by the death of a loved one. Observing her was that clear a lesson in itself. We got to talking about the inauguration and what fun she and Virginia had, and how impressed they both were by the reality of Arkansas in contrast to myth. Then out of nowhere, she offered this. "You know, Jim, I've been thinking a lot about your suggestion that I move to Arkansas, and I might just do it." I was dumbfounded by this turnabout in attitude and preference. How come was about all I could muster as I held myself back from becoming too excited until I could see something real come of it. Well, Virginia and I were talking yesterday, and I thought, What a wonderful state Arkansas must be to live in. If the governor would take 10 minutes of his busy schedule to make me feel important, and I don't even live there. Here in New York, the governor has so many state police surrounding him, you can't get close enough to even see what he really looks like. Whew! I was blown away by her deep realization. I never got to see her newfound dream fulfilled, though, for she died exactly 2 months after the occasion of my inauguration. I think it must have been from a broken heart. I'm not ashamed to say that I have invested a good bit of my life since then, completing the cumulative grieving process over their departure. I feel so blessed to have had them take me on loan. They were absolutely the best. There was yet another special something I learned from each of them, but not until after they had gone to the great beyond. I vividly recall the stories, and while this is taking a little longer perhaps than usual, I think they're worth telling. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself sitting with all the relatives that remained on my father's side in the sunlit backyard of my cousin Stavros and his family, who lived in Eponymi, a small village outside Thessaloniki, Greece. I speak very little Greek, just enough to be dangerous, I'm accustomed to saying, and most of my relatives spoke little or no English. But one day, one of my cousins, Tassos from Athens, was my translator. He spoke very good English. Dad was the only male of 6 children, and what was left of his sisters were actively participating in rapt conversations with one another. There was diminutive Aunt Eleni, then 88, and hearty like a 50-year-old. Aunt Tasula, then 86, sipping on a glass of white wine and puffing away in a cigarette like a teenager trying her first pack of weeds. And then, of course, there was elegant Aunt Artemis from Athens, 84, sprite as I was, full of fun and games. At one point, I became curious about how Dad came to leave Greece, so I asked Tassos to inquire of our aunts what it cost him to leave. He asked, and they chatted a bit about it until he turned to say, "They want to know your version first." Well, I responded, Dad always told the story this way. When he was about 15 or so, he got on the ocean liner in the harbor in Thessaloniki to visit with a friend who was a merchant marine. His friend showed him around the ship at great length, and they got so involved in doing so that the ship had set out to sea without them being aware of it. As the story goes, he stowed away under the tarp of an emergency vessel until they could figure out a way to make it legitimate for him to be there. Needless to say, they got caught, so they put Dad to good use doing odd jobs around the ship. Eventually, he put him to work in the galley. I recall Dad telling me he used to wear a ring of garlic around his neck to ward off sickness aboard the ship. He sailed around the world a few times before landing for good in the Brooklyn Naval Yards, where he began his life in America. The long and short of it is that he never went back home, afraid that his father would severely punish him for being such a bad boy. All along, Tassos was translating the story I was telling. All the women, and by now all the rest of the family, were gathered around the picnic tables, were enraptured by the goings-on. As Tassos finished my version of the story, my aunts laughed uproariously in unison. "What's going on?" I inquired of Tassos. He asked what was so funny, and after a fashion or two, he laughed. Everyone was amused at something, and I had not been made privy to it. "Well," continued Tassos, "your aunts say that's not really what happened. They think it's funny that your father told the story differently from what actually triggered it all. You see, your grandfather was, I think you would say it, a stern man, very stern. He was always after your father to be a doctor, but your father didn't want any part of that. One day he and his father had a big blowout about it, and your father ran away from home. They didn't hear from him until a few months later, when he finally wrote to say he simply had stowed away on the ship, vowing never to return home. He never did." On Mom's part, well, it was during the viewing of her body at a local chapel on the evening before her funeral, that I was alerted to a long-standing family secret. Family and friends were gathered, sitting around and reminiscing about times long since past. At one point in conversation with my aunts and uncles, Mom was also one of 6, with 2 sisters and 3 brothers, all remaining at the time. I mentioned something about wanting to visit Helena, Montana one day, where Mom had said she was born. Helena? What does that have to do with anything? Inquired Aunt Jean. Well, Mom always said she was born in Helena, that's all. I was curious. With a laugh, Aunt Jean said, no, that's not true at all. She was born in Roundup, Montana, but she never wanted anyone to know that. Can you imagine being born in a place with a name like Roundup? Kurt was too embarrassed to admit that she was born there, that's all. The collective enjoyed the exchange to no end, and other stories began to be spun, one after another, like how every week during the Depression, Mom and Dad would bring sacks of food from town out to my grandmother's farm in Forestville, some 5 miles away. And now Aunt Connie, who used to work in Dad's restaurant with Mom, had a crush on Dad, but Mom had won his heart instead. On and on it went. Years later, while visiting a friend in Montana, I got to check out Mom's story for myself. Yep, she sure was born in Roundup. Early on, I said that I believe that one of the main reasons we come to this planet is to actually become the stories that will inform and inspire others to be what they really are, lovers of the first order. Sure as cotton, Mom and Dad became their stories, and just as sure, they had proved without a shadow of a doubt that they were lovers of the first order. In fact, I can see Mom and Dad in that light even now. Mom grooming heaven's gardens with the beauty she is, and Dad entertaining with wisdom the angelic array of love painters. I think my grieving is finally finished. Well, maybe. I'll continue celebrating their lives, though, no matter what. I confess one last thing. Some years back, after first losing Dad and then Mom, each precisely 2 months after an inaugural installation ceremony, I decided irrevocably that I would never again be inaugurated. I have only one brother or sister left, and I'm not going to risk losing them that way. That's for doggone sure. Well, that's the end of that chapter. I hope you enjoyed those stories. They sure touched me as I went through them. Matter of fact, at one point I had difficulty reading it, so I'm sure you must have caught that, which is fine, of course. Well, that story's finished. We'll have a new, fresh one next week. So I'll close with just a very quick post that I saw, which really speaks to how my father and mother lived their lives, at least how I came to see that. And I hope you see your life the same way. The post does not have an author that I can find, but it's here's what it says. Work for your soul's purpose, not your ego's desire. Work for your soul's purpose, not your ego's desire. Well, that's a telltale one for sure, isn't it? Well, okay, folks. Thank you for joining me this week. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you love plenty and are extremely happy. By all means, share your stories. Write some. Tell some. Please help the bringing on of more storytellers in our lives. It's so important to us all. It's what brings us to the truth of life. So, my friends, until next week, namaste. I love you. I sure do.